Yeah, well, I started shrimping like a lot of the young boys in Port Royal. In my case, no one in my family was shrimping. My father was in the Marine Corps, but uh, one of the young boys, his daddy was one of our early shrimpers, the Vukases. Johnny Vukas was 2 years older than I was. And I started shrimping, go out in Johnny's boat with he and his father, not as workers, just to ride on the boat. And in that process, you learn something about shrimping. And a lot of young Beaufort and Port Royal boys would do that. They would go out with their uncle or friend or whatever. And if you showed an interest in it, and if you were a hard worker, well then, as likely as not, after a period of time, you could get a job. So just by riding on the boat, you got to learn. And like I say, if you showed an interest, and what it took is the ability to work. I mean, you could go on the boat for nothing and go spend an interesting day, but if you wanted to have a job on the boat and get paid, you had to show the ability to work, to get the job done. You're mainly picking up shrimp, and it was almost like an apprentice school. You'd go out, and then little by little you're learning and not even realizing it. The captain would tell you, hold the wheel and say, hey, just run this way, and he'd go outside for a minute, come in and check on you. Little by little you were learning. And that's how most of the young men, before there were any father-son passing on of the shrimping industry, that's how they learned. Then as men with families who owned their own boat, of course, if they had sons, they often would go right into their father's footsteps. They would be on the boat when they were very young, and they would learn and then step right into the job.
What were some of the safety issues that you guys...
Well, it was always potentially dangerous, and I think it was always, there was someone that had an eye on you as a child if you were riding on the boat or working on the boat. It was potentially dangerous. And here again, it's a matter of how you acted, and the owner of the boat or the captain, whoever, if you didn't have and listen to what they say and all, well, you wouldn't be allowed to go back. That's all there is to it. We went out on different boats at different times and never had any problems with being able to go. It was, the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, Port Royal in particular was very small at that time. And all the guys that owned boats, they knew who all the kids were. That's Alice's son, or that's John's son. Yeah, you can go. Ask your mom because it's all right with your mom and dad or whatever. And that's how a lot of people got into it and all. But the safety issues you learn. Invariably, there was some kid that stepped on a catfish and went through the shoe, got hit with a stingray, a little one, doesn't have to be a big one, but, pinched by a crab, slipped and fell on the slimy deck, just different little things that, that you learn. You didn't get to handle any of the equipment until they felt fairly confident about you. Now, in the earliest days, and I'm talking about earliest days for myself, not for the whole industry, but in the earliest days, even here in Port Royal, the boats were relatively small, and the equipment wasn't as big and as mean, I guess you might say. It was a little kinder, but as time went on, everything got larger and more powerful and more dangerous. So, and it was a long time before any regulation came into the industry. Some of the things that you might not think about now, the early days on the boat, they were very Spartan. There was no heat. And we worked in the winter. It was cold as the devil, and that damp cold, and all you'd have for heat was maybe a little 2-burner stove, a little propane stove that you had a tank of propane gas. And it would be a little bit warmer in the house than it was out on the deck and all. So there wasn't much heat. Everything was Spartan. The cooking ability, 1 or 2 pots, everything was very simple in those days as compared to now. It's a whole different ball game. Generators that ran electricity started coming into the boats in the 1980s and really into the 1990s, where they had generators that actually operated air conditioners. So the more modern boats in the 90s, they'd have air conditioning. There wasn't any air conditioning in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the mosquitoes, if you anchored out at night, they would tear you up. I mean, you could hardly get to sleep. You'd have to wrap up in July in a blanket to try to get a little sleep. And then needless to say, the sun, all of us boys, we were all suntanned. You can believe that. Everybody was suntanned and blonde-headed. And some of us worked for money and some not. But usually after you went out on a boat a few times, you either didn't like it because it was a long day and you were away from baseball and everything else, or you did like it and you wanted to do it.
How long would you stay out?
Well, most of the time, most of the boats here were day boats in that they rarely stayed overnight in the 50s, in the early days. And then as it moved along and the boats got a little larger, and also more competition as there were more boats, the pie, so to speak, the pie being the shrimp, was divided into more and more pieces. So in order for a man with a family to make it, he had to work harder and longer. And that's when these guys would start staying out overnight and all. Drop the anchor up in the river so you could work later in the morning and be there earlier and cut down at the expense of coming and going.
What about competition from different states? Was there regulation?
Well, what first started when boats started coming up here as this shrimping opened up and it was really good, the local people didn't like boats coming from elsewhere. And pretty soon they tried to keep them from doing that by charging them a higher license fee, which they reciprocated and charged out-of-state boats. Because see, we had a season here that ran roughly from May to December. And not all of those months were good. So oftentimes, if our shrimping, for whatever reason, ended early, then we would go further south to shrimp. So if one state put a higher license price to another state, pretty soon it ironed out and they had reciprocating agreements. So all that kind of went away. But they tried to keep that. And everyone more or less coveted their shrimping grounds. Like the Port Royal boys, they weren't too excited about boys from St. Helena coming over here and fishing the Port Royal grounds, and guys from Hilton Head. You had a legal right to do it, but your ground was kind of coveted, and you didn't welcome them with open arms always.
Were there ever any incidences?
Oh, there were lots of incidences. There were lots. Jack Chaplin, he was one of our early shrimpers. He started shrimping before World War II. He made note one time talking to a group of school kids about it. He said the gentleman days went out in the 1960s. And it used to be that the Port Royal boys, if one of y'all ran up, say behind Paris Island, and dropped your anchor, waiting for the tide to get right to catch shrimp, and let's say while you're waiting, 2 or 3 other boats came, well, they would tie behind you, and when you got ready to make the drag, everybody else would untie from you and drift around while you got the first pass down the bank. And like Jack had said, that was the way we did it in those days. Then, when there got to be a lot of shrimpers here, they started not doing that. They didn't wait for you to pull your anchor. They shrimp whenever they wanted to, and that prevailed from then on. And it got to be like a Le Mans car start. When it was time to put overboard, everybody was elbowing everybody and running. And I don't know if you've ever seen how the Le Mans car race used to start. The guys would all be away from their cars. And then when they said go, they had to run, jump in their cars and go. Well, that was kind of like it. There was a legal time you were allowed to start shrimping. And once that time started, every man for himself. And sometimes the boats would run into each other. Sometimes they'd catch each other. The nets would catch each other. Not often, but these things happened. Yes, they happened.
And where were the shrimp boats built?
Well, the first ones that came here were built down in Florida, where the boat builders were. But as time went by, men worked learning how to build boats, and they moved where the shrimping was. Now a very interesting one right here in Port Royal, George Randall. George Randall lived right down here in Paris Out. He built some very good boats, and you have some nice pictures of him here in the museum. And George told me when he was down in St. Augustine shrimping, is where the main boats were built. He said when they would come in from shrimping when he was young. He said a lot of the guys had money in their pocket and they'd run up to a bar. He said he would go down to where the Greek guys were building the boats. And he said he would watch them. And he said none of them would really talk to him. And then finally, one of the guys that he had noticed over a long period of time, he had asked him a question, and they befriended each other. And he more or less told George and let George watch, and George learned a lot about boat building from them. And George built maybe 6 or 7 boats here. He built a couple right at his house, and to launch them, that went down right down Paris Ave with them with big wheels under them, and launched them right at what we call the Sands now. Built a couple up under Paris Island Bridge up there at what they call Wright's Landing. He built the Swamp Box, the Miss Latina, the Captain Buster, the Harriet Ann named after his daughter. He built another one or two that I can't remember the names of, but I remember a lot of them when they were new. But George was a very good boat builder. And then he built some boats in Beaufort. There were a couple of... The way it worked is these guys started learning from the Greeks how to build boats. Wherever there were shrimpers, they wound up being shrimp boat builders. Still, the main place that people bought boats was down in St. Augustine. Mm-hmm. They had the Greeks that built the sponge boats out of Tampa, Florida on the west coast. They came over to the east coast because there was a demand for these boats. And they're the ones that more or less designed what we call a shrimp boat. And it evolved over the years.
What's a sponge boat?
Well, those are the double-ended boats
Okay.
that the Greeks used to do sponges with in the Mediterranean. And when they came over here, they were diving for sponges in the clear waters on the west coast of Florida. That didn't work up this way. The water was too muddy. We didn't have the same kind of bottom. But they came over to the east coast where the shrimping had started, and they used their boat building knowledge to build a boat that would work for shrimping with a motor in a boat. And then the boats have evolved ever since then. Constantly getting more and more sophisticated. A modern boat of today would have hot and cold running water, washers and dryers on the boat. The crew has their own bathroom and shower. The captain has his own stateroom. The boats are fully electric. Everything, refrigerator, everything just like a house. They have power steering on them just like a new car. You can turn the wheel with one finger to drive a great big old boat. And they freeze the shrimp on the boat now. They don't have to come to the dock like boats used to have to come to the dock every 2 or 3 or 4 days. They don't have to do that anymore. When I was young right here in Port Royal, before the season started, we'd go to the dock all the time because we'd sit on the boats and fish for little tiny fish when we were kids. But I remember you'd hear someone say something like, well, Captain Tony went out yesterday, and he'd just go out and he'd pull the tri-net, not the big nets, looking for shrimp to see if they'd showed up yet. Or somebody might say, hey, Captain Tony didn't come home yesterday, which means he's catching shrimp. Or that somebody say, hey, Captain Tony put on some ice yesterday, which was a good indication he was going shrimping in the early part of the season. But there were only a handful of shrimpers. Then a lot of times from them, it was their sons and relatives and other young men that stepped into the business. Like I say, in 1980 was the peak year for shrimping in South Carolina. The most number of licensed boats to shrimp in the state was in 1980. The majority of them shrimped in Beaufort County. Now here's another thing. When it first started shrimping in Port Royal, started off with this one man, Charlie Deccio, who brought his little 10 boats up here by invitation. But every time he went back to Florida and they found out how much shrimp he was catching, when he'd come back up here in the spring, and they only shrimped a couple of months of the year in the spring. They didn't shrimp all year long. They didn't know the shrimp were here all year long. But every time he'd come back, there'd be more boats following him. Pretty soon, Port Royal was filled with shrimp boats. This was 1924. And in just a few years, Port Royal was absolutely filled with shrimp boats. Everywhere in Port Royal was shrimp boats. There were 5 different fleets of shrimp boats shrimping out of Port Royal. And then there would be some independent boats that didn't belong in a fleet. Just one man owned his boat and also came. So Port Royal was so filled with shrimp boats that they started going up into Beaufort to shrimp out of Beaufort. Now this was all before my time. We're talking about starting in 1924, and in about 1930 or so they started coming into Beaufort, and they filled up all of downtown Beaufort with shrimp boats from the bridge all the way to what is the marina now. The back of all those stores had docks. The cotton had stopped, the steamboats had stopped, everything had stopped, so the docks were there and they were empty, so it was perfect for shrimping. But when they first started shrimping in Beaufort, they did not have access to the railroad. That's what made Port Royal work. When they first started shrimping in Beaufort, they had to haul the shrimp from Beaufort all the way down Depot Road to the railroad station by ox cart. One man, can't quite remember his name. I didn't know him, but I just remember from the history. He's the first one that did that. And then once trucking came in, it allowed the shrimp docks to be built out on Ladies Island and all the other places where we didn't have shrimp docks because they couldn't get the shrimp to a market. And the market was New York. From 1924 when it first started to handle any amount of shrimp, those shrimp had to leave here and go north. There wasn't a population around here. The only sizable population in the earliest days of shrimping was Savannah and Charleston, and that wasn't that big. The market was in New York. So if you didn't have access to a railway in the early days, you couldn't have a successful shrimping business. For the first years in Beaufort, they didn't have access to the railway other than by ox cart. And that, you can't move many. In Port Royal, they could take the shrimp right from the boats into fish houses in big barrels and put them right on the train. They couldn't do that in Beaufort. So once they got the trucks, it really opened up everything. Then, you want me to continue on with this history? So then, shrimping was doing well. There were more and more boats. Technology in shrimping also advanced. Technology advanced continually, just like it has in anything else. If you think of an automobile when you were young, you had crank-up windows. Now you got push-button windows. Everything has changed. The cars have gotten better. Air conditioning, didn't have air conditioning in cars. So the technology always changed in shrimping, and it might not have been big and fast, but every bit added to it. Didn't have radios on the boats to start with. They used hand signs. After World War II, when there were military surplus radios available, then they started having radios where they could communicate from boat to boat. The interior of the boat started getting better. The Citizens Band radios that you think about that with the trucking industry, shrimpers had it before the truckers. A lot of our technology in the shrimping industry came from the oil industry in Texas, where the Texas shrimpers learned about it because the oilmen had the money. The big money was in the oil. They were the first ones to have radar. They were the first ones to have LORAN. They were the first ones to use CB radios. And as shrimpers from there came here and back and forth, we learned about those things. So simple little things that you never even think about. When I was young in shrimping, the nets were made of cotton, just like a shirt cotton. The twine was fairly thick. So you could pull one net to start with, and then here again the technology came out of Texas over to here to pulling two nets. But what advanced was after World War II. Here again I'm talking a little bit about before my time, World War II. I wasn't shrimping then. I started in the 50s. But in the 1950s we were still pulling cotton nets. Then after World War II, they had started making a blend of cotton and nylon, and they called it Nyack. Now what this did, instead of having twine this thick, it could be half that size, which if you've ever been to the beach and pulled anything at all into water, you know what water resistance is. So now that it was starting to get a little bit easier to pull the nets, the motor started getting larger, the boat started getting larger, the technology came in, radar, which when it was foggy, no one could hardly leave the dock in the old days, and they could continue to fish. Everything added to it.
Could you really make a living, the shrimpers, with the cost of boats?
Okay, now let me say this about it. You know, the shrimping was like anything else. Let's say golf, all the golf professionals. There's a lot of golfers out there, but there's a handful of them that are really great and good. Same thing with basketball players, a lot of basketball, but same thing with shrimping. Now, there were a lot of shrimpers, but there were only a handful of the guys that were the best, that really did well. Now, others could make a living, but some of them really shine, just like in real estate sales or anything. Yes, you could make a living, and you did make a living, but to varying degrees. Some were better than others at it. Some had better equipment than others. Some maintained their equipment better. Funny thing about the shrimping, there was no requirement whatsoever to be a shrimp boat captain, other than you be 16 years old and you be a naturalized American citizen. So anyone could become a shrimp boat captain if you wanted, or if someone else had a boat. A lot of guys got into it by operating a boat for another shrimper who had 2 boats or 3 boats or 4 boats, or from a non-shrimping investor, which was often the case. And you had good years and bad years, naturally occurring good years and bad years. If you think about shrimp, if you think about mosquitoes, they're a lot alike in that if the conditions are right, you'll have shrimp coming out of your ears. Just like if the conditions are right for mosquitoes, you'll have plenty of them. And the same thing with the shrimp. So you'd have good years and bad years in the shrimping. In the bad years, the shrimpers that had been in it and at it long enough, just like farmers, they would just tighten up and they would survive. And a lot of people came in the shrimping industry and left for a number of reasons. It just wasn't their cup of tea. Maybe they weren't making it. Time away from their family. You had to put in a lot of time on a shrimp boat. You had to put it, you might put in a lot of time as a farmer, but when you came home from your day, you were home. And as shrimping got more competitive and guys started staying out longer, and also started going down south further chasing shrimp, which they didn't do in the early days, you were gone more and more and more. So,
how many men were on a boat?
well, generally 2, as according to the boat and its size, be a captain and 1 crewman, or a captain and 2 crewmen. And this pretty much even prevails into today. It had to be a pretty good big boat to have more than 2 crewmen. But here's another interesting thing about it. If you think about the value of a shrimp boat, if you think about, let's just say in 1960, my parents' first house they owned in Mossy Oaks, my father was in the Marine Corps, so they didn't have to own a house early on. But anyhow, they bought that house in 1957 maybe, and it was $9,000 in Mossy Oaks. Now, it was a new house. A new shrimp boat in about that same year would probably run you $8,000 or $9,000. Now, a top-of-the-line shrimp boat might be $12,000 or $15,000. And like our house was an average-sized 3-bedroom house in Mossy Oaks. So just to give you an idea of the value, the value of the shrimp boats would run all over the spectrum. Some guys could break into the business with a little boat. Some guys could do well and buy a bigger boat. The average shrimper in South Carolina owned 5 boats in their lifetime. This was the industry average. Just like owning the first car. Once you own one, you generally, when you sold it, you bought another, and it was usually a little newer and better. Same thing with shrimp boats. Some people owned more. Some people sold one and kept one. Some of them would keep 2 boats, but just generally speaking, the average in South Carolina was to own 5 boats in a shrimping career of 30 years or 40 years or whatever it was. In all of shrimping, Beaufort County had the most amount of shrimp boats and the least amount of dock space. Now, this comes from the Department of Natural Wildlife in Charleston. They had done a survey. Beaufort County had the most amount of shrimp boats in the state. They had the least amount of dock space, so the boats had to tie alongside of each other on and on and on. And the boats were of the least value. The average captain on a shrimp boat, I think in 1980, or no, in the 1970s, I forget some of the exact numbers, but had 20 years experience, I think, maybe 11 years behind the wheel. There is no such thing as an average catch. Like, what is your average catch? There was no such thing. You had good days and bad days, and good years and bad years, and some were better than others, and, you know, breakdowns, a lot of things. Here's something else that happened in the shrimping industry here. Once, a phenomenon more or less, is when they discovered shrimp in Key West. Now, you wouldn't think that would affect Beaufort at all, but it did, because shrimping in Beaufort, before 1950, when locals were in the shrimping business, it was a feast or famine. You either had a good year with plenty of shrimp or enough shrimp to make a living, or if it were a bad year, you didn't do very well, and that was it. Not many shrimpers could tie their boat up and get a job elsewhere because there weren't any jobs here. What few people had lawns cut their own lawns in Beaufort. There wasn't any such thing as lawn service. A lot of things we don't have now. So there weren't a lot of jobs available. So if you had a bad year, you just tightened your belt. Now, in 1950 is when they discovered shrimp in Key West. They didn't know there was shrimp. They knew there was shrimp in Key West, Florida, but they couldn't catch them. They tried to catch them and they couldn't. They didn't realize that these shrimp were nocturnal. All the shrimping was going on in the daytime, all up and down the East Coast in Florida. The water's crystal clear down in Florida, down in Key West. It's not like the East Coast. So when they realized you had to catch these shrimp at night, what effect that had was the demand for larger boats, because Key West was a long way away and it was often rough weather down there. So these Greek guys were building larger and larger boats to fish the Key West water. Then, if a man from Beaufort, Port Royal, wherever, didn't make enough money in the season here, they could always go to Key West. And in Key West, the season never ended. Now you might think, well, why didn't they just move there and stay? Well, some did. But home is home. But they could go down to Key West. If your engine blew up in the middle of the season and it took forever to get it fit, whatever, anything could happen that could cause you to lose the season. And though the season might run from May to December, you're not going to catch shrimp every day and every month, any amount of them. It's very sporadic. It's in between. There could be good days, bad days. So that's why Key West changed it. It allowed you to invest more in a boat, in a larger boat. And a lot of Beaufort boys went to Key West and shrimped. And also, you know, before Key West, they started following the shrimp south as the water cooled off. And you'd go down to Georgia and shrimp, down to Brunswick, down to Fernandina, down to St. Augustine. And but then Key West was the big game changer. That was the big game changer for shrimping.
What about
Well, here's another thing while you're thinking.
Okay.
The water festival was dominated by shrimp boats. It was a big thing for the shrimpers. There was kind of a lull in the season, but that wasn't the main reason. And the water festival wasn't started for shrimp boats, but it was a water festival. And we had lots of boats here, and it was a natural to have a blessing of the fleet. And it was a great time to be able to bring a shrimp boat there and anchor it out and have the wife and the kids and friends come to the boat. So all of the river of Beaufort would be shrimp boats out there. It'd be 40 or 50 shrimp boats. Everybody cooking on the boats and spending a night or two out on the water and all. And hardly anything else other than shrimp boats. There were hardly any other boats out there. It was shrimp boats. Then, and there was still shrimping going on in downtown Beaufort. up under the bridge at Von Harton's, all out on Ladies Island, but they all came to the water festival. They had the blessing of the fleet, and they gave a big prize for the best decorated shrimp boat, things like this. Then, when they decided to build the waterfront park, they tore down all the docks where the shrimp boats were, and of course that made the shrimp boats move elsewhere, and they scattered. They went to Hilton Head, they went to Von Harton's up under the bridge, they went out on Ladies Island to all the various shrimp docks out there. And it was kind of said, and maybe not officially, that, well, when this waterfront park is done, this will be a place where the farmers and the fishermen can sell their stuff. Well, I guess it kind of outgrew that, and that never happened. It became quite sophisticated as what we know it now. But the long story short is, the shrimp boats just didn't come to the water festival anymore. After the waterfront park, it started dwindling down, and also the shrimp boat, the shrimp boat industry was cutting down from the 19. There were fewer and fewer shrimp boats, but it was a big deal for shrimp boats. Coming to the water festival was a big deal for shrimp boats.
Talk about the recent, demise of the shrimping industry.
Okay, well, it's been talked about in the paper and other media a lot. One of the main reasons they say for the demise of the industry is the imported shrimp. Now, imported shrimp have been around for a long time. It was mentioned in the early 19th. Let me just mention something else real quick. In the 1950s, there was nothing in the Beaufort Gazette that was headlined more than something about the shrimping industry. It was very important in Beaufort. It was very important in Beaufort. Now, what was that question you just asked me?
Moving forward, like that, the demise of it.
Okay, so
started dwindling from 1980 on.
So it was very important in Beaufort, but there had been mention of imported shrimp in the 1950s. There was an article in the News and Courier that said something to the effect like 2 million pounds of shrimp were imported into North America. Well, that wasn't much compared to what was caught, and all of those shrimp that were, and this was mentioned again several years later, and it kept increasing. 2 million pounds and 11 million pounds and 50 million pounds were being imported. Now, all of these imported shrimp were from foreign countries that caught them with trawlers. Germany, Japan, South America, different places that caught shrimp. It wasn't until the 1970s that they started raising shrimp. And once these foreign countries that had the climate, Southeast Asia and South America, started raising shrimp, that number of poundage of imported shrimp skyrocketed. It went from, in the 1960s, 1 out of every 10 shrimp eaten in America was imported, to 9 out of every 10 shrimp eaten in America was imported, which drove the price of shrimp paid to the boat down. There's an interesting little story about Walter Gay. He told me out in at Gay Seafood. He said he had just shipped some shrimp to one of the breeders that bought shrimp for the restaurant industry. And when the guy called him and said, Walter, he said, I can't give you that for the shrimp. It's 50 cents less a pound. And Walter said, what? If we can't survive on that, what's going on? He said, well, listen, Walter, he said, right now, he said, I can get on the phone and I can have a shipload of those shrimp here tomorrow at 50 cents less a pound. He said, I just can't pay that for them. And that drove the price down. Now, it drove down the profitability, too. So, when the shrimping started suffering, when the income got reduced, well, you know you're going to take care of your family, you're going to make your house payments, you got to keep your car and truck running, but the boats started suffering. A lot of boats, varying degrees of catchability. The guys that were the best at it had the best boats because they were better at it and made more money and could maintain their boats. The guys that weren't as good at it, especially on the bottom end, they fell out. The guys that maybe weren't that good at it the maintenance would start suffering. You know, First, you wouldn't paint, you wouldn't do this, you wouldn't do that, and pretty soon the boats on the lower end of the spectrum would miss more and more days of shrimping because of breakdowns and other reasons, bad nets. Once the nets got really bad, they would catch less shrimp, and if you weren't catching enough shrimp to buy new nets, you catch less shrimp. So the shrimping, the imported shrimp had a big impact, but
What happens to if they're not shrimping here? What happens to that population of shrimp?
Well, if you're not shrimping here, you're not shrimping here because there's not enough shrimp to make it worth your while.
Okay.
So you could go north or south where it may be better. You could fish up in North Carolina at certain times. Their shrimping is different than ours. But usually you would go south. Where, let's say if we had a severe winter, it could hurt our shrimping here, decimate it. So you might spend all your time shrimping down in Fernandina, St. Augustine, and even Key West. So the weather could hurt it. So anyhow, as another big factor involved in this is there weren't other jobs for shrimpers. Beaufort County didn't have the jobs. Just think about the days now before the air station. Parris Island was a good employer, but there were no other hardly jobs. There just weren't. There were no landscape maintenance crews. You couldn't get a job with a landscape company. Everybody did their own. Our roads were somewhat, we didn't have a lot of highway department work, just not the jobs. So the guys that stayed in the industry in the 50s and 60s often did that because there was no other way that they could make a living. If they quit, what were they going to do? Nothing. Farming had started playing out. Farming was a big, substantial supporter in Beaufort County. And shrimping kind of fell in where farming started petering out. It took the place, not took the place, but it provided jobs. And the reality is it provided jobs for uneducated people that couldn't get certain jobs that required certain other skills. And because a man was uneducated didn't mean he wasn't a hard worker and all of that. So, and that's where fishing could fill the bill. And not only was shrimping here now, you got to remember that we also had crabbing and oystering, seafood. Shrimping was the big money maker, and the crabbing and the oystering. The crabbing and the oystering were minor compared to shrimping. But the shrimping industry was big and important here.
What about that? We talked briefly about the canneries.
Well, in the early days of shrimping, they canned shrimp. Even when they had ice, a lot of shrimp were canned, which opened up a market to a whole different place. And as we had mentioned earlier, in Savannah, they were canning 50,000 pounds of shrimp a day. Now, granted, not every day because they didn't always have the shrimp to can, but there were 3 or 4 canneries there that canned these shrimp, which opened up the market to send them everywhere. They went to Russia. They went to France. They went to South America. They went to Canada. They went all over the United States. These canned shrimp from our area right here. Well, these other 2 industries were also pretty big, and they employed a lot of people. A lot of, like, the oystering was one man, one boat. So you had a lot of men supplying the oysters. Oysters were big. Oysters started before shrimping because you could harvest oysters and they could sit outside on the dock a day or two in the wintertime when they did most of the harvesting with no quality diminishing. Shrimp you couldn't do that with. So the oyster industry started first, and we had a couple of big entities in the industry. We had the Majoni Company, who started in Savannah and came over here, and they're still here in Port Royal. They're the oldest industry in Beaufort County, and the family, the Majoni family, is still here. They had a lot of different labels they put their products up under. And Blue Channel was in Port Royal. The Blue Channel Corporation, they processed crab meat. And not only was it a big deal that they processed crab meat, but they had found out how, I'm not sure the man's name, if it was Mr. Sterling or who, but they had found out how to preserve the crab meat where it wouldn't lose its pretty white color in the can after it was cooked. And that was a big deal because it was very unappealing looking in stores and in cans until they perfected this. So Blue Channel was canning crab meat, and that was a big deal. They were shipping it all over the country. Also, a little funny thing is that Blue Channel actually canned tuna fish one time. In the late 1940s, I was a youngster here in Port Royal. They had a couple of tuna boats that would come in here regularly, some years in a row. And believe it or not, they came here from the Galapagos Islands. And the reason they came to Port Royal, it was closer to come through the Panama Canal to Port Royal than it was to go from the Galapagos all the way up to San Francisco. And how they made the connection that they had the ability to process and can the fish, I don't know, but they did. They did. It was a little part of that history that just came and went. But it employed a lot of people. The oyster industry and the crabbing industry employed a lot of people.
The gentleman that had the boats that he named after every one of his wives.
Okay.
Or wife.
Right. Yeah.
That's just a problem.
Well, anyhow, and we were going back and talking about the first guy that came here, Charlie Vecchio, by invitation. He came up here and he brought 10 boats with him. Every one of his boats were named after his wife, Jessie. They were called the Jessie 1, the Jessie 2, the Jessie 3, the Jessie 4, right on down the line to 10. His wife, Jessie, was 28 years younger than he, I think. I think that's how old she was, 28 years, quite a bit of difference. But nonetheless, now here's something. He was from Portugal. He came up here from St. Augustine, I believe. But a European and a tradition amongst fishermen that came here was usually an immigrant fisherman, as they did in the old country. Every time they had another child, they would add a boat to their fleet. Two of our early immigrant fishermen that came to Port Royal as youngsters fishing and stayed and made a life out of here were the Lediches. Their house is right down here on Paris Avenue. Mr. Ledich, I remember him. I remember him well. I was young, but I do remember him. He built the house himself. He had 3 children. He had Arlene, Marie Ann, and Tony, his son, Anthony Ledich. Tony Vukas was the other immigrant fisher. And both of these guys came from the Adriatic. They did not come from Portugal or Sicily or Spain. Anyone with an accent in the early days in these areas was called Portuguese. They used to call Captain Tony and both of the Captain Tonys. One was called Tony, one was called Anthony Ledich. They came from Yugoslavia and Austria. And both of them were often referred to by people that didn't know them well as Portuguese. Everybody thought the Portuguese were the only fishermen. So Tony Vukas, he also had 2 daughters and a son. Kathy and Narcissa and Johnny. I started fishing with Johnny, his only son. So anyhow, they each added a boat. Each time their family grew, they added a boat to the fleet. There's some people if you want to let them in. So anyhow, and this often happened with immigrants that came here to this country. And Anthony Ledich, he added more than just his family to his fleet. But that was a trait that these foreigners had. Then there was a guy whose name was John Miluzewicz. And John Miluzewicz came from this same Adriatic area. He came to Port Royal, but he came through the way of Florida also. But when Charlie Vecchio's wife died, I think she died in 1937, he was pretty upset about it. You know, he was very remorseful, and he quit fishing. He quit and left, and he went back to Mayport, Florida, where they were from. Spent the rest of his days there. But I think somehow someone found out, but I think it was John Miluzevich came up here and took over his places. Now, this first guy that came here, Charlie Vecchio, he started in Port Royal. But as Port Royal got filled up and overflowed into Beaufort, he also had an operation going in Beaufort. He had the old cotton factor dock at the foot of the bridge. What was that called? Wilkins?
McDonald Wilkins.
McDonald Wilkins Cotton Factor building. Cotton had run out, so he had that, and that's where he operated his shrimping fleet out. And there were others in Beaufort. But anyhow, so he had 2 docks, and when he went back to Mayport, John Miluzewich from the Adriatic took over his dock in Port Royal and brought his boats in there. And all of his boats were named after his wife, Mary. He had the Mary M., the Lady Mary, the Queen Mary. I can't remember all the names, but he had, I think, 5 boats. But also, he built some boats in Port Royal. Let me back up to Charlie Vecchio a minute. When these guys came here to shrimp, they didn't just come on the boats. They brought their net makers with them, and they brought their boat builders with them, because the boats had to be repaired if anything happened. This was just the way they did it in those days. So there was a guy named Vasilius Vakerakis. He was a Greek boat builder who had come to Port Royal with Charlie Vecchio in 1924. And he got killed by the train in Port Royal. He got run over by the railroad train in Port Royal. And we know all this because there was an official inquest held. And the doctors that pronounced him dead and everything, they all had written about it. But 2 of his friends went to where he stayed in Port Royal and found a letter that stated that, and they stated in an affidavit that his name is Vasilius Vakerakis, and he was from Greece. And he had come to Port Royal from Florida with Charlie Vecchio. So it was all kind of documented. So then, John Miluzewich, as World War II broke out, a lot of people anglicized their name because they had foreign names. And anyone, especially from Italy, they were often Anglican. But yeah, John Miluzewich, he anglicized his name and he became John Marion. And he operated the shrimp dock at Port Royal for quite a few years. And he had 5 or 6 boats. When the shrimp were discovered in Key West, his 2 sons went to Key West to shrimp, and it was so good they never came back. And when he left, the shrimpers at Port Royal, Vukas and Ledich, and the newer ones that were Port Royal men and all that had become into the industry, they operated the dock kind of as a cooperative. They operated that dock at Port Royal until the state port was revised. They wanted to get this port going again, the port of Port Royal, which it originally was back in the sailing days. It was a port. So they got some federal money and all, and they built the big new cement dock that we see now. That cement dock was a wooden dock. When I was young, it was a wooden dock. And that's where the sailboats would come in, big sailboats to get coal. It was a coaling station. And a coaling station could be compared to a filling station on the interstate highway. Like these ships, they could leave, say, Nova Scotia heading to Cuba, and if they needed coal, they could stop in Port Royal and get coal. And the reason why they could stop in Port Royal, they had this wonderful, deep, natural channel to come into. 200, 300-foot sailing boats drawing 18, 20, 22 feet of water. So anyhow, that's what that dock was originally built as. Then when they tried to revise this shipping, and they got some federal money and they built the big new cement dock, they condemned the old Port Royal dock where the shrimp boats were. Shrimping had already been kind of in decline at this time. and it was in the 1950s, maybe 1958 or whatever, because the state had bought all that property, the Ports Authority, where the cement dock is. They tore down the old wooden dock, where the shrimp docks were, which is up in one of your pictures, the old coal, what they called the coal chute dock. And they built it and condemned all that property. They couldn't have those shrimp boats around these great big ships that would be coming in. They just didn't want to do it. So that put an end to that dock. But a couple of people in Port Royal got together and wanted to make sure the shrimping industry in Port Royal didn't die. And they developed the property where the fish camp is now into a shrimping dock. And they developed that. And there was a big fight going on in Beaufort County. Hilton Head was fledgling development. Also, Beaufort County realized its vulnerability because we had no jobs and we needed some kind of an industry as a base. And they wanted to, a German petrochemical company known as BASF, that's the initials for the German name I can't pronounce. They were slated to put in a big petrochemical company up on Victoria Bluff on the Colleton River, and trying to develop this fishing industry here. They wanted it, some entities wanted it to go up there on the Colleton River. Some of the entities up on the Colleton River wanted to see a big industry there. There was Chicago Bridge and Iron, CBI, and this big German BASF. So nonetheless, while all that was going on, they got some money and put up the new shrimp dock that's over there by Blue Channel now. So the old dock went away. And that's how that revived the shrimping industries for the next 30 years or so, up until now.
I have two last questions. Number one, when you stopped shrimping, I mean, what year and reasons why, and then also your personal feelings about the last of the shrimp boats that left and what happened.
Okay. What was the first question?
The first one was what year that you stopped
Okay,
shrimping.
okay. Okay, I'll do that one last.
Okay.
So anyhow, and in the shrimping industry, you know, it had a lot of nice little highlights, and there were a lot of shrimp boats around, and it was important to Beaufort's economy, but less so as our population grew. And the air station had a big effect. It created a lot of jobs. So we have Parris Island, the air station, and then we just had a natural growth of population, which had a lot of jobs available for people that didn't want to shrimp. So little by little, the shrimping industry is just kind of getting smaller and smaller. The boats that weren't taken care of got older and older, and pretty soon, then we had a couple of spikes in fuel that really hurt the bottom. So the shrimping industry somewhat died a natural death, maybe. It's not quite dead. Here's a funny thing about the shrimping industry. It had a lot of ups and downs. It had high peaks and good years and innovation that came into the industry and great new boats, and boats were being built out of fiberglass and steel and all these things. But in all the ups and downs from 1924 even into today, just think of this. The shrimp have never cared what happened. They did what they'd been doing all along. They didn't care if there were 400 boats in the county and everybody had to fight over the shrimp, or they didn't care if it was one boat. The shrimp did what they've always been doing, going through their normal life cycles, good years and bad. And that's the way it is today. So now, I did write a book. In the course of writing that book, it took 6 years. At the end of that 6 years, which is in about maybe 2016, 2017, the last year I canvassed the whole state of South Carolina. I went to every shrimp dock that I knew of. All the major ones, there may have been one or two little isolated ones that I missed. There were less than 36 full-size working shrimp boats left in the state, down from over 1,500 that could shrimp here to less than 36 in-state boats. And it's went down a little bit from there, and now it's coming back a little bit. As far as now here's another thing. The average size boat, say in 1980, was probably 50 foot, 55 feet. And the power and everything else, the electronics and all that the boat had is nothing compared to the modern boats of today. The guys that stayed in the business, the guys that were young enough to not to be too old to work now, are doing very, very well. Their boats are very sophisticated. They catch one of these modern day boats with a good captain that knows what he's doing and a good crew, is catching as much in a day as 10 or 12 or 15 of these other boats caught in a day. So if you looked out there and you saw one boat, just think, he's catching as much as 10 or 12 boats. And if you stop and think about it, there's no competition for him. A bad thing about it is, this is not the kind of thing that you can learn out of a book. You've got to have hands-on experience. You've got to work with someone older that knew a lot that you could learn from. You can learn why you don't drag over this area, for what reasons, and there can be a myriad of them: bad bottom, rocky bottom, soupy mud to tear up your nets. You can't learn now like we did when I was young. The first boat I ran was a little boat, and I made all the mistakes in the world learning. And like a lot of other guys my age did. We all made mistakes in the process of learning. But we could survive them. But now these guys, they've got a lot of expense involved in these boats. $600,000 is not uncommon for a modern new boat, a modern new shrimp boat. The average price of the boat that's right now working in Beaufort County, I would just guess is close to $200,000. It's got to be. That's what the value probably is of it. And like I say, they catch a lot of shrimp now, a lot of shrimp. So if you start thinking about all this, and you think, well, where is all this going? What's going to happen? Well, here again, the shrimp haven't cared. If nobody's catching these shrimp, there's going to be somebody that's going to say, hey, I can do this. I can learn, and they will learn. And maybe even come from somewhere else where there's still a little more of a fishery going. And what's happened in Beaufort County in South Carolina has happened all up and down the coast from Texas to North Carolina. Because not only did the industry have a lot of problems, but also we had gentrification, which we're getting ready to witness in Port Royal right now. Gentrification is what happened with the waterfront park. Got gentrified. Von Harton Seafood, which was right there on Factory Creek, right there, is now condominiums and everything else. It's just a reality of life. But the boats are very big now, and you can't break into that business easily. You just can't do it. It's hard to. You can't get behind the wheel of a $600,000 boat if you don't know what you're doing. Not many people that have that amount of money will venture into buying a shrimp boat. They can't. They could buy one, but there's no one there to run them. It's a hard knot in the industry now, because how do you learn it? How do you learn dirt farming? Not big farming, but a small man with 30 acres. How do you learn it if you don't have someone to learn it from? How do you learn? A simple little thing. There's a certain way you use chicken manure on a farm. You don't just spread it out. You have to put it out one year to plant the next, and so many other things. So the same thing with the fishing industry. I don't know where it's going to go. I honestly don't. I know that the guys that have got the big boats that are old enough to know what they're doing, none of these guys are much younger than 60. There's a couple of them that have pretty good sized boats that are that age, that have sons that are working on their boats. But there's not many people coming up behind them. But here's something I think is going to happen. We mentioned the crabbing and all, and a lot of the crabbing is done with small boats. And I'm talking about 18, 20-foot fiberglass boats with pretty big motors on them. And unlike the old days when they pulled the crab traps by hand, Ned, Ron, and I pulled crab traps right out of Blue Channel when I was still in high school. We pulled 125 traps twice a day by hand. We left the dock here. We went all the way down around Paris Island, all the way up Broad River, up under Broad River Bridge a ways, and then we'd take a break, and then we'd come and run the traps again. Now, these guys have trap haulers now that run off of a separate little engine, where all they do is they grab that float, stick it on there, and it pulls the trap up. They can run a lot more traps than we do. The reason I'm mentioning all this, these guys are starting now to pull nets behind these crab boats. Now, they don't have big ice holds. They'll carry big coolers. But I think that this is what's going to happen to the industry. I think more of these crabbers are going to start shrimping. And I think we will have a revision of the shrimp industry with these smaller boats, unless something cuts them off from the protected waters that they are now allowed to shrimp in. Right now, you can start shrimping at the headwaters. There's a legal line, but it's still pretty protected. It's not all open ocean fishing. If the law were to change, and if it were to go to only open ocean fishing, these boats couldn't do it. They couldn't fish in that weather. It wouldn't take much wind to make it too rough and too unpredictable. So that could change the industry, and what the shrimping would become then is all big boat shrimping, and they would not necessarily be from here. They would be from Florida. They'd come up at the times when shrimping is predictably good. They'd be from North Carolina and Florida and Georgia, and some from South Carolina. And they would go where the shrimping is good, when it's good, and leave. Some of them might stick around a little bit and take a chance, but by and large, that's where it would go. Most of the boats now are freezer boats. They freeze the boat. They freeze the shrimp on the boat. They can keep them as long as they want. So they don't have to have a shrimp dock to unload them at. They don't have to have ladies and men to head the shrimp. They don't have to buy ice. And they carry enough fuel to shrimp for 30 days. So they can make a trip down to Key West and be there a month and bring the shrimp back here if they wanted. Or they can shrimp here. They can do anything they want. It's a whole different ballgame now. It's kind of like, in a way, the guys that canned the shrimp and put them in jars and not sold them fresh. It's all different ballgame. So I honestly, I can't guess where the industry's going. I'll tell you what, it's hard to buy fresh local shrimp right now in Beaufort County. We don't have many shrimp boats. There are some boats that freeze the shrimp on the boat, and once it's frozen, it's different. It's different from that shrimp right off the deck. There are a few on Ladies Island. You got White Seafood. You've got Sea Eagle, which has their own boats. Charles Gay's got some boats out there. And their whole family shrimping history is really interesting about the Gays and how they got started. Both of those men worked on Paris Island. Their fathers and their grandfathers worked on Paris Island before they became shrimpers. All that's pretty interesting history. So I don't know where the industry's going. I think as long as the shrimp are reachable, and you should always be able to cast net for shrimp. So here's one more little interesting thing. In 1886, the federal government did a survey down the coast, I think into Georgia and all. But in 1886, South Carolina produced over 600 and some odd pounds of shrimp, more than any state in the United States. All of these shrimp were caught with cast nets and big beach seines. Big. It took like 30 men to operate on the beach catching shrimp. 1886. But once trawler shrimping started, that fell out. That would never revive again, but cast netting. You can catch shrimp cast netting, and you're allowed to do that. And that, a lot of people do that. But that's not going to make an industry. You're not going to get enough shrimp cast netting to ship to New York unless something changed in the laws and all. But I can't answer that. I think about myself. I think that the crabber guys that start shrimping will be our main hope to have a good supply of fresh local seafood locally. Small boats, not big boats, Because the big guys catch too much shrimp, they freeze them, and it's a big commodity, and they just go right from the back of the boat on the forklift truck into a tractor trailer, and you're talking about 30,000 pounds. They'll hold 20, 30, 40, 50,000 pounds on these boats. So they might shrimp 30 days in a row before they unload the boat. And it's nothing for a boat like, let's say, one of the local boats like that that's here. If he could get 10 cents more a pound for his shrimp in Fernandina, and he's shrimping right here, when he quits working that night, he could be in Fernandina the next morning and unload his shrimp, and that's $3,000 difference right there. So it's a different ball game. It's a different commodity. The shrimp are still here. That's the thing. That is the thing. When I finished that book, there were 2 shrimp boats left in Shem Creek. 2. Shem Creek, even though it got started later than Port Royal, it had a powerful fleet. I think because there was more money available in Charleston. But anyhow, they developed a powerful fleet. There were 2 boats left. Now they're up to about 5 or 6. They've got a hell of a population into Charleston. We've got a population here of shrimp consumers. Mm-hmm. But we don't have access to much fresh local shrimp. And I think we will have. The shrimp are going. There's going to be some people that get tired of hammering nails on roofs and building houses and cutting grass on golf courses. And there's going to be some guys who are going to say, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to shrimp. And they will. And they'll figure it out. Just like compared to farming. We know that a lot of farming has gone to big, what we call factory farms. But we also have some very good small farmers that like what they produce and produce it well and produce it fresh. And they do get a little more money for theirs because it is fresher and better. And it'll be the same thing with the shrimp. They will get more money for their shrimp because they'll earn it. I mean, it's a better product. It's a better product.
Do you have anything?
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about Port Royal as a fishing village. You know, Port Royal, in my lifetime, early lifetime, was a fishing village.
Now, just to kind of explain to me what he's talking about, how it.
The people who lived here made their living out of the water.
Well, it pretty much was. Well, Port Royal, because see here, Parris Island had a lot to do with Port Royal development of a fishing industry, and the reason why was because the men that came to work to Parris Island raised families here, and it wasn't the men that worked at Parris Island as much as their families as they grew older became fishermen. But Port Royal had Blue Channel here, the crab factory, which they moved from Beaufort. They started in Beaufort, Thacker Creek, and moved to Port Royal in, I think, 1937. But before that was L.P. Majoni Company. They started in Savannah, had their first oyster factory on the Fusky, and the next one, I'm thinking it was 1886, but I'm not sure about the date. Was in Port Royal, right where the restaurant over there on the water is now, the fish camp and all. That's where Majoni's earliest oyster factory is. Now don't quote me on these dates, but I'm thinking it was like 1909 that they moved from Port Royal up to Factory Creek. And why, I don't know. I don't know why they moved up there and they built a whole new place. I don't know.
When you were a boy, were the streets named Parris Avenue, or were they still numbers at that point?
No. They're all named after the ports that Port Royal did shipping business with. And I used to, even as a kid, when I'd ride my bike, the city limit sign was right down there past the school a little ways. And as a kid, I could stop my bike there and I could look clean through the town and see Parris Island. And even as a youngster, I thought, that's pretty neat. You know, I could look clean through the town and see right through the town.
And if you were riding your bike through the town, what would you have seen? I mean, as far as buildings and people,
well, there was
roads. What were the roads like?
Okay, now, they were paved, but where that big Parker's filling station was I think it was Laverne Smith's gas station, and I think it was an Esso station, and he had little sundries in there, little candies and cookies and stuff. That was one stop as a kid we could make. Then as we came on into town, Funderburk's Grocery was that brick building right over here. Mr. Funderburk, Billy Funderburk and his family, they had that store. He was a grocery store, a little grocery store. Then the next door was Metcalf's grocery store. They also sold cuts of meat, dry goods, things like that, sodas, ice cream, all of that. Then we had the Shepherd store. And right across from the Shepherd store was another building just like the Shepherd store that was closed when I was a kid. But it burned, and we found a lot of old silver coins and all in the charcoal after the store had burned. But then you had the Shepherd store, it was really winding down. The Funderburks and the Metcalfs. And I went to school with both of their kids. Tony Metcalf, we all went to school at the Port Royal School, and Laverne and Louise Funderburk, they were all my age. We all went to school at the Port Royal School. But so that was it for Port Royal. A couple of people still had cows in their yard. One or two people would have a horse, but they didn't ride it around town. They might plow something with it. Like for a lot of these new homes over here, was all an open field, and I don't know who it was that had a big garden there. Here's something. So on the other side of the other side of Reboat Road, I mentioned Ned Ron, you know where the Coca-Cola plant is? But there's some houses back there further that were there before all those apartments were built. Everyone that came from there, we took a path through the woods to come to Port Royal. And the path started right there and went into those woods and went just all through the woods and came out into Port Royal. We hardly ever walked the road. We'd walk the railroad tracks. If you were going down to the shrimp docks or the Port Royal, we'd take the path to come to school. Hardly ever the road until we had our bicycles, and we rode bikes. And when I was young in Port Royal, you never hardly ever saw one person on a bicycle. There was always 2 or 3, and sometimes even 4. We didn't have that many bicycles. So there'd be one guy on the handlebars, one guy on the seat, one guy on the back, or any combination of that kind of stuff. And every one of the young boys here in my area in the 50s had a pet raccoon. You'd be walking down the street and you could see someone else coming up the street, and my coon would be behind me walking. His coon would be behind him. I had a pet deer, and I lived on the other side of the railroad tracks. I rode my bike to school, and the deer would sometimes follow me to school on my bike, and it would jump in and look in the window, and Miss Irwin, it would disturb the whole class. So Miss Irwin would make me take my deer home. So I'd get on my bike and I'd ride all the way back on the other side of Reboat Road. My grandma would hold the deer by the neck till I got gone. Then go back to the school here. Go to school.
But what about the story of the schoolboys being able to go from the school all the way across on these oak trees without touching the ground? I've heard that
I never
story.
heard that.
Yeah, I
I
just
never
wondered
heard
about
that.
whether that was true or
I
not.
don't think so, because I don't remember. Because even when I was young, there was only one tree that we really climbed in that we as kids called the walking tree, because we could get up in it and walk on the limbs. But that's where Battery Creek, all those little houses are now. That was before they were built. But I don't remember that story. But I remember my 2 sisters and myself and my 3 cousins, when they would bring us lunch to school, it would be a big grocery bag full of warm egg sandwiches with ketchup. We never had mayonnaise. We had ketchup. But hot eggs, we each got 2 sandwiches at lunch. Every day it would be egg sandwiches for lunch. Other people had other things, but and we mentioned Waldo Finney, talking about Waldo earlier. Waldo and her sister Janet. Waldo's sister was named Janet. I'm going to have to ask Waldo how she's doing. I haven't seen her since that school days. But they were at the school also. And everybody brought their lunch. And it was pretty little.
And were you all disciplined in the...
Oh, very disciplined. you got the ruler. You got the ruler if you misbehaved. The teacher she'd walk right up to you, and it wasn't stand up and bend over. They'd come over and swat you right in your chair. Yeah.